Hello, dreamers, and welcome back to the show. I want to thank you so much for being patient and understanding with me over the past month. But I do want you to know that just because I've been thin on releasing content doesn't mean I don't have a couple of things that I've been juggling. I do have a collaboration coming up. I have this episode, and I have about 3 others that are partially written. It's just all about me getting them recorded. To be honest, I've had kind of a hard time sitting down and focusing. So today I'm going to try to just stay on track and record as much as I can. My daughter is visiting at the moment, but we've been hanging out all weekend, and I told her, you know what, I'm feeling good today. Let me go ahead and record, and then we'll hang out later. So I have that going on. My boss, the mom of the toddler that I take care of, had her baby shower last weekend, so we went to that. But for today and over the next couple days, I have no excuses other than Evelyn being here, but it's just about me being in the right headspace to record for you guys. So today's the day. After I record this, I might take a break, have some lunch, take a shower, try to regroup, and then come back and record the Patreon bonus for you as well today. So fingers crossed that all goes well. Okay, that's all I got for now. That's plenty with the niceties. Let's get to the story. This is a story about a crime that's today obsolete, at least here in the United States, probably in a lot of countries around the world, though I imagine that in some places these things still happen. And that would be the kidnapping for ransom. At the turn of the millennium, however, not everybody was ready to give up on that just yet. This is a story of 2 men who were immigrants to this country, one from Russia and one from Lithuania. They came to the United States for a better life and an opportunity. They would end up causing a world of pain and devastation for countless friends, families, and loved ones of those that these 2 chose as their targets. This is your 271st episode of California Dreaming, the tale of the kidnapping ring, Jurijus Kadamovas and Jouri Mikhel. Jurijus Kadamovas was born on October 22, 1966 in Lithuania. And Jouri Mikhel, he was born April 9, 1965 in Leningrad. It was the USSR at the time. How they became acquainted, that I'm not quite sure of. If I happen to figure that out by the time I'm finished writing this episode, I'll come back and edit that back in. And clearly I still don't know because I'm back to it, and I didn't find any information on how these 2 men became friends. What I do know is they both ended up in the Los Angeles area. They both resided in the San Fernando Valley, and they would eventually go into the fish aquarium business together by opening up a shop they called Design Water World. At some point, these guys, for whatever reason, just woke up one day and were like, you know what? I'm over the fish aquarium business. Let's get into kidnapping, hostage taking, and ransom demanding instead. So, a new business venture was born. In October of 2001, friends, Kadamovas and Mikhel, the 2 of them began discussing, developing, and rehearsing a plan to kidnap a 58-year-old local real estate developer named Meyer Muscatel. Now, in the story, I believe Meyer is the only one of them that is not Russian. He was Jewish American, I believe. Anyway, I'm just going to refer to all of these men by their last names. And as we go along, I'll remind you periodically who everybody is. You don't have to remember who everyone is. It's just a little bit of a complicated case. So, where was I? Businessman. Meyer Muscatel. Okay, so the idea was for Mikhel to pose as a businessman who was interested in purchasing some real estate. To that end, Mikhel asked Meyer for an appointment to meet with him in order to take a look at a potential property to which Meyer agreed to meet. Mikhel gave him the address of the property he ostensibly was going to be showing him, but it would turn out to be Mikhel's own house, which was located in the city of Encino, California. Waiting at that house was Kadamovas, along with another co-conspirator named Einar Altmanis. There are about 4 other people who were known to be involved in some capacity in this whole crime ring, and like I said, I will remind you of who they are as we discuss them. As you may have guessed, this whole thing with Meyer was all a setup. When Meyer arrived there at the house, he was attacked. He was bound and handcuffed, duct taped, and someone pistol whipped him in the head. Altmanis was the one who bound Meyer's legs with plastic ties, while Kadamovas handcuffed his arms behind his back. They put duct tape over his eyes, and when he was hit with the gun, he began bleeding from the wound it created on his head. They robbed Meyer of his wallet, which had several credit cards, while they bombarded him with questions about his finances. At some point, someone tried to withdraw money from Meyer's bank account, but whatever they did, they triggered that bank account to become automatically frozen. So once Kadamovas and Mikhel realized that they were not going to be able to get any money out of Meyer, they decided that he was useless to them. They injected him with Dimidrol. You know what? I'm going to check the pronunciation of that for y'all because I know how much you are sticklers for grammar and pronunciation. Hold on. Okay, I'm back. So I'm going to go with close enough. They injected him with this Dimidrol, which is an antihistamine that has sedatives in it, and they held him down on the ground. Mikhel then placed a plastic bag over Meyer's head and pinched his nose shut until he suffocated and eventually stopped moving. At that point, they decided to put Meyer's body into a van that belonged to Kadamovas, and they drove him to the New Malone's reservoir. I did look up New Malone's previously, so I think I got that one right. Now remember, all of this stuff with Meyer went down in the city of Encino, which is in Southern California. So when I looked it up on maps, it shows that this New Malone's reservoir is about a 6-hour drive away. So it's quite a distance for a body dump. Clearly, they were trying to put some distance between themselves and this crime. There are very few cases that we've covered where the body has been driven 6 hours to be disposed of. So I thought that was a unique aspect of this case, that they went to those lengths to separate themselves from what they had done. So they drove all the way north in the direction of cities like Stockton and Sacramento to this New Malone's reservoir with Meyer, who was dead, in the back of their van the whole way. They arrived at this point where they decided to dump him, and they brought him out onto this Parrots Ferry bridge. And at some point, they were carrying him on the bridge, and they ended up accidentally dropping him, leaving some blood evidence behind on a nearby curb or some pavement. They picked Meyer back up, carried him the rest of the way over to the reservoir at the edge of the bridge, and then tossed him over the side. Later on in this case, another accomplice named Alec Markovskis would recall a time when Kadamovas told him that he once threw a Jew off a bridge, and that Kadamovas thought it was hilarious as he told Alec this story. So this plot to rob Meyer Muscatel was a massive fail. Kadamovas and Mikhel decided to move on to their next target, cut their losses, and try again. A wealthy Russian businessman named George Safiv would become their next target. However, they were going to change things up a bit this second time around, and instead of kidnapping him, they decided to try and kidnap his financial advisor instead, a 39-year-old woman named Rita Peckler. And what they wanted to do was use her as sort of like a lure to bring George in. So 2 months after they murdered Meyer, in December of 2001, Kadamovas called up Rita and pretended to be in need of some real estate advice. Rita agreed to come and pick Kadamovas up and take him to a property that he told her he was interested in purchasing and wanted to ask her some questions about it. So she picked him up and they went to this property, and it turned out this time to be Kadamovas' own house. Remember, the last time they had taken Meyer over to Mikhel's house. When Rita and Kadamovas arrived, waiting for them inside was Mikhel, Altmanis once again, and another friend / co-conspirator named Petro Krylov. He was there also. And this time Mikhel was armed with a gun that for some reason was outfitted with a fake silencer. That's what the court document said. In a TV show I watched about this, they didn't mention it. They just called it a silencer. So I don't even know what the purpose of putting a fake silencer on a gun would be, but whatever. Altmanis, he too was in possession of a weapon. This time he had a stun gun. When Rita walked into the house, it was Mikhel who grabbed her first. He restrained her and told her that they wanted her to bring George Safiev to them, and that the only thing that they would do to her would be to get her drunk on vodka or inject her with Dimedrol, and then leave her unharmed in a motel. Rita told the men that she was pregnant and that she was worried about drinking alcohol or being injected with drugs and how that would possibly cause harm to the baby. But it's like just about pointless to me to try to reason with someone who is doing something as crazy as what these guys were trying to do here. I mean, this crime that they're trying to commit is literally insane to try to pull off. So I personally don't think that there's anything Rita could have said to try to reason with these people who are obviously very unreasonable. Yeah, so even though Rita told them that she was pregnant, as if they would care, they continued to try and carry out this plan and to use her as a lure to bring George to them. Eventually, they got Rita to agree to contact George, and she did, but he was like, "Sorry, I'm busy," and he hung up. After George received that phone call from Rita, I can only assume that talks of a ransom demand were had. So George hightailed it out of the United States and ran all the way back to Russia immediately after that phone call. And of course, this was yet another kidnapping for ransom fail. And with that, Rita Peckler now had to die. And she met with the same fate as Meyer Muscatel before her. She was injected with Dimedrol. They strangled her. They drove her to the New Malone's Reservoir. This was their second trip there in as many months, and threw her body off the Parrots Ferry Bridge as well. And while I didn't see it in the court documents, it is my understanding that this time around with Rita Peckler's body, they decided to try and weigh it down so it would not be coming to the surface anytime soon. They did not take that extra step with Meyer Muscatel though. So now we're still in the month of December of 2001. Kadamovas and Mikhel are 0 for 2 when it comes to getting any ransoms. So the two of them began plotting against their next target, a gentleman named Alexander Umansky. The accomplice who was present at Rita's murder, Petro Krylov, he's the one who suggested Alexander to Kadamovas and Mikhel. Alexander, he owned a high-end custom auto electronics shop, and Petro used to be an employee of his, so Alexander was a former boss. When I say custom auto electronics shop, I want you to think MTV's Pimp My Ride. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe not as obnoxious and over the top as Pimp My Ride, but it's that flashy and probably super expensive. Mikhel called Alexander up and pretended to be a customer who needed some electronic equipment or wanted some, this is a want, not a need. He wanted some electronic equipment installed in 2 different cars. During the course of this conversation, Mikhel asked Alexander if he could give him a ride to one of the cars. It was parked nearby. It was actually parked at Kadamovas' house. They could go and get it, and Alexander could get started on the custom work. Naturally, Alexander was excited for the work. This was going to be, some good money for him, and he agreed to pick Mikhel up. Mikhel directed Alexander to Kadamovas' house, where he, Altmanis, and Krylov were again lying in wait. Kadamovas had the gun, Altmanis had the stun gun. When the 2 men arrived, they attacked Alexander immediately. Kadamovas sat him down in a chair. His hands were handcuffed behind him, and his legs were bound with zip ties. They took his keys, his cell phone, and his wallet while asking him questions about his finances. Later on, Mikhel and Altmanis used Alexander's debit card to take money out of an ATM, and in doing so, their images were actually captured on that ATM's surveillance system. Alexander's ordeal inside Kadamovas' house would go on to last for 3 seemingly endless days. During those 3 days, Mikhel and Kadamovas ordered Alexander to call his brother and demand money in order to secure his release. But like with Meyer and Rita before him, Alexander at some point became unnecessarily alive. They decided that it was time to get rid of him because this had been dragging on for too long. Altmanis was ordered by Mikhel and Kadamovas to go to the local sporting goods store and to purchase some weight plates. When he got back from the store with the weights, Mikhel took some plastic bags and shoved them into Alexander's mouth. He duct taped his mouth closed and placed another plastic bag over his head. At the same time, Kadamovas held Alexander down and pinched his nose shut. But it didn't go quite as smooth as when he had done that same thing to Meyer Muscatel. And they were unable to effectively suffocate Alexander. At the time, the guy was only 35 years old, so he was more than 20 years younger than Meyer. He had probably had a little bit more fight in him, and I'm sure he fought hard. And if you're getting the impression that these 2 guys that are pulling all this crap off, Kadamovas and Mikhel, are kind of a couple of idiots, I don't think you're alone in that, because I think they're a couple of idiots. To me, these are literally 2 men who seem like they would actually have a hard time taking candy from a baby. Somehow, I can see a baby getting the best of these 2 and not even lose a single piece of candy while doing so. That's how lame I think these guys are. How do you kidnap 2 people and get exactly $0 out of it? And they're idiots for trying to go back and do it again. If you ask me, that's just my opinion. Anyway, they're sitting there trying to suffocate their 3rd victim, and they couldn't quite do it. So Mikhel, along with Altmanis' help, took a piece of rope, twisted it around Alexander's neck, and strangled him to death instead. Then the 3 of them this time, Mikhel, Kadamovas, and Altmanis, they tied a weight plate around Alexander's body and placed him in the back of Kadamovas' van. They then drove over to Mikhel's girlfriend's house, where they had dinner while that body was outside in the back of the van the whole time. After dinner, the 3 accomplices then drove, once again, to the New Malone's reservoir, where they threw Alexander's body off the Parrots Ferry Bridge, just like they had to Rita and Meyer before him. But just because Alexander was dead, it didn't mean things were quite over just yet with him. Prior to killing Alexander, while they were still attempting to squeeze money out of his family, Mikhel and Kadamovas had sent a ransom note to them demanding almost $235,000. It was a random amount that it seemed like someone just kind of pulled out of nowhere. $234,628. And so for purposes of this episode, we're just going to say almost $235,000. They found the note the morning after the kidnapping. Alexander's family did. When they saw that Alexander had never come home from the night before, remember he had gone with Mikhel to go pick up a car that they wanted him to customize. So Alexander's family had started calling around and looking for him. Some of them, I believe it was either Alexander's dad or his brother, or maybe even the both of them, they had gone over to Alexander's custom auto electronics shop to see if they could find any clues or information as to where he might be. And in the fax machine tray, that's where this ransom note had been sent to. They looked at the fax, but at first it was confusing because it was made up to sort of look like an invoice where the shop owed money for some goods and services and this invoice needed to be paid. But when you look closer, it really doesn't specify what this invoice would have been for. Originating in Dubai, at the top it says, as per the invoice number 8538 of December 8, 2001, please send the funds by wire transfer according to the following details. And then it lists the bank where to send the amount of money which was listed at the bottom, and it said thank you in advance for your payment. Alexander's father and brother were suspicious of the fax right away because they didn't do any business in Dubai. This was a custom auto electronics shop. Business is local. When beginning to take a look at Alexander's disappearance and then putting it together pretty quickly that they had a kidnapping for ransom situation going on, when they found that letter in the fax machine tray, they decided to contact local law enforcement, and that's when the FBI got involved. They started taking a look at Alexander's business associates and clients. They wanted to know if there was anybody that he had a problem with or anyone that the family knew of that would want to do him any harm. Did he owe somebody a large sum of money, like some serious debts that somebody was trying to recover? But the more they looked, the less they found. There just wasn't anybody that they could find in Alexander's life, past or present, that would want to do this. He was a really well-liked guy. He was very social and had lots of friends. Everyone loved him. And, he was also a dad. At the time the story took place, he had a 2-year-old. And it wasn't like Alexander had tons of money himself. He made, I guess, somewhat of a modest living doing custom auto electronics installations. But, they're not trying to get money out of him. They want to get money out of his parents or his family. They're the ones that provided a good amount of financial support in getting that electronics business off the ground in the first place. So now we have the first situation here with Kadamovas and Mikhel, where the FBI is actually going to get actively involved while the kidnapping victim was thought to still be alive. I don't know if I'm exactly clear when Alexander was gotten rid of, but this carried on for quite some time after his death. And you'll see how much torment that they put this particular family through. When the FBI got involved, they set up a wiretap at Alexander's family's home so that they would be able to monitor all of the incoming calls. Right after the agents got set up, the phone did ring, and the voice on the other end was Alexander himself. And he was speaking in Russian. He said, "This is serious. When everything is paid off, that's it. They'll release me, so everything will be fine." Alexander's dad asked him how he was doing, and he told him that he was okay and to not worry about him. But his dad could tell in the sound of his voice and the tone of how he was saying things that things were definitely not okay. His brother said that Alexander's voice swayed from sounding fearful at one moment, calm the next, and then sometimes agitated and stressed. He went back and forth. Alexander was able to tell his family that he was being held against his will, that he was kidnapped, and to get that amount of money together in order to pay these guys. The only way for him to be released is for them to pay this money, and to do so by a given deadline. Alexander was kidnapped on December 13th, 2001, which was a Thursday. The deadline that the kidnappers issued was the following Monday, December 17th. Alexander also warned his family to not get law enforcement or the FBI involved in the case. There would be no negotiating from the amount that was being demanded. No more, no less, but just exact. That's the amount needed. No earlier than Monday and no later than Monday. Do not say anything to anyone. But we know that the FBI was already involved in the case. They were recording the conversation when Alexander was telling his family to not get them involved. Once they had that phone call with Alexander, the FBI began trying to trace that phone to see where it came from, but it turned out that the kidnappers were using a prepaid phone with minutes that you buy in advance, and the subscriber information on the phone was fictitious. So all that with the phone provided no leads, with the exception of one. Remember when I said that Alexander was speaking Russian in the phone call? Well, it was not normal for him to speak in Russian because he didn't really speak it as fluently as his older brother and his father. So Alexander would be the one to almost always choose to speak in English. It stood out to his family that he was speaking in Russian instead when he made that phone call. So it had the FBI thinking that the people who were holding him hostage might be Russian as well. And that narrowed the suspect pool pretty significantly. So the FBI decided to hit up some of the local police departments and ask them to check in with some of their Russian sources and informants to see if they could find out anything about this kidnapping. And the FBI agents would be doing the same with their sources, but everybody on every end came up empty. Nobody knew anything about any Russians in the Southern California area operating a kidnapping for ransom ring. Whoever was behind it was keeping it very low key. Alexander's dad even went to speak to some people affiliated with the Russian mafia, but they did not have any information about any kidnapping ring that they knew of either. If there even was an official Russian kidnapping gang operating locally, they would most likely know about it. And the Russians, all of them, say we know nothing. Eventually, the FBI and Alexander's family got another incoming call. And this time, on the other end of the call, it wasn't Alexander, but it was a man speaking in Russian that was actually calling from Russia, acting as a sort of middle person to relay information. But this time, this caller talked about the consequences if they didn't get the money to them. A part of that was going to be to start cutting off body parts, fingers, ears, I presume, things like that. The pressure was just becoming too much for Alexander's father. When they saw that ransom note in the fax machine at Alexander's shop, they contacted the FBI, and they did eventually advise the family to go ahead and pay part of the ransom in order to give the kidnappers a reason to keep Alexander alive. So that is what his father did. He would pay part of the ransom to try to keep Alexander alive and buy some time at the same time for the FBI to try and figure out the kidnappers' locations and where they're holding Alexander hostage. That initial amount that Alexander's father paid was a total of $89,000, and that money went straight into a bank account situated in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. So now the FBI has come to believe that these kidnappers, they're a group of people that are behind Alexander's kidnapping. They're Russian, most likely, and they came to believe that they had connections and resources and associations all over the world. The FBI also started to believe that this gang of kidnappers were also very good at what they did, and that they knew what they were doing. And to be honest, that's not exactly the impression that I got from researching this case. I mean, from the way that they bungled the first two kidnappings, it wasn't very impressive. And I didn't think that they knew what they were doing. They didn't do enough research on the person that they were actually kidnapping. That was my whole thing. It was like they kidnapped somebody to use as a lure, and when they contacted the target to pay the ransom, He was like, no thanks, and hung up. So clearly, the guy didn't give a shit about their hostage. And that means that they didn't do their research. But I guess when it comes to all the technical stuff, all the details that go into trying to pull something like this off, that these guys seemed good at knowing what to do and what not to do in terms of actually pulling off the actual physical crime. It was the act of killing people that they also kind of messed up. I suppose you just really wouldn't know how difficult it is to kill someone until you give it a try. And it's not like you can go around practicing, but for what it's worth, they were able to grab a victim and leave absolutely no witnesses as to what happened, no trace evidence, no clues, no nothing. Just they caused these people to literally vanish into thin air. That was very baffling for authorities and the FBI, and that's why they thought these guys were kind of like criminal masterminds. Personally, I think that's giving them a little bit too much credit. But maybe with Meyer Muscatel and Rita Peckler, the first two victims, they were kind of practicing, so to speak, to try to see how the scenario would play out. And maybe getting the money wasn't the priority, but was actually getting away with the kidnapping and the disposal of the body. At the end of the day, these men still were able to steal 5 lives, just like that, and nobody saw or heard a thing. 2 days after Alexander was kidnapped, the FBI pulled up some of his bank records and found that someone was using Alexander's ATM card going back to just a couple of hours after he went missing. From there, investigators were able to pull the video surveillance images from one of the ATM withdrawals, and it was not Alexander making those bank transactions. The man that was caught on the surveillance video did have on a dark beanie, and it was kind of pulled pretty low down his forehead to try to conceal his identity. He also tried to conceal his face somewhat with his hand. He walked up to the ATM. He put Alexander's debit card in. He did a couple of balance inquiries, and after that, he made a withdrawal of a couple $100 before walking away. Now, this video also captured images of the vehicle the man at the ATM was either driven there to the ATM machine in, or he drove there himself. They weren't quite sure. The cameras didn't capture images of who was driving or what the license plates were, but it was clear enough of an image for investigators to figure out the make and model of the vehicle based on the specific characteristics on the car itself that are captured in the video, and then they can isolate and identify those different parts as belonging to a specific make and a specific model of a car across a range of model years. The same thing just happened in the University of Idaho murders with the gentleman who, I don't like to call him a gentleman, but I don't even want to speak his name, so I don't know what else to call him. Asshole? Murderer? Killer? Piece of shit? Anyway, you all know what I'm talking about. They identified his car from all of the different video cameras that were everywhere around town as he drove around on his murder journey. Back in 2001 and 2002, when all of this was happening in this case, there weren't cameras everywhere, but there were definitely cameras at ATM machines, so that was a big, huge place to get evidence from. Cameras situated around town and around cities that were built into the ATM machines that faced the streets. In this case, it turned out that the vehicle was a Lincoln Navigator. The video was in black and white, and it was at nighttime, but they could see that the Lincoln was either a light-colored Lincoln or it was white, maybe off-white. The FBI then began to develop a theory as to why Alexander may have been targeted to try and further their investigation to get some directions to go in. And they did think it had to do with his auto electronics installation business. That's a business that his father helped him to establish. So let's get this right. This isn't a place that you're going to bring your car if you're not prepared to spend thousands of dollars to customize your high-end car, sports cars, luxury vehicles, whatever. In fact, Alexander customized his own SUV as well, to a point where the thing became worth more than $100,000. And remember, this is 2001, so not everybody had screens and cameras inside their vehicles, but his His had that and more. So because of all of these fancy extras that he put all over his car, they're thinking this guy is making money hand over fist. And because of the custom auto electronics business and his own flashy car, those are the things that made Alexander an attractive target. The $89,000 was sent to the kidnappers by Alexander's father. And this money is going to be traced everywhere it goes by the FBI. The Monday deadline passed. So the next move the family made was to attempt a phone call to Alexander's cell phone. Both his parents and his girlfriend left a variety of emotional voicemails, begging for his safe return. Alexander's father even left a voicemail offering to trade places with him. But they never heard back. Nobody answered. Nobody returned the call. 10 days passed without any phone calls or any word from the kidnappers, until suddenly, that same middle person in Russia called the family back. He had new demands and issued fresh threats. They wanted the remaining balance of the ransom amount. In the FBI recording, this middle person was speaking Russian and said, he'll either transfer the money for him, the amount that was indicated, or the money will be worked off by him. So his kidneys will be sold, his liver. If his won't be bought, then yours will be bought, or everyone else's. So now, the game has changed, and everybody in Alexander's family and Alexander himself are having their lives threatened. So, Alexander's family spoke to the FBI and decided to go ahead and make the remainder of the ransom demand, and that would be $145,000. So, they were going to do it without proof of life, which is something that I would think they would always insist upon. But the kidnappers absolutely refused. So it has me thinking that Alexander is already dead, because this went on for a long time and the kidnappers were getting mad and frustrated. So I think that they were the ones that would have broken down eventually, not the FBI or Alexander's dad or his brother. I think those kidnappers would have been worn down into finally caving in and putting Alexander on the phone, but I don't think they did because I don't think they could. So yeah, they were not going to have any proof of life that Alexander was even still around. His father just wanted to pay the money and to get this over with and just hope that everything would work out for the best. It was a long time for them to be sitting around and waiting. It was like 2 weeks. And that sounds stressful. So the family tapped everyone that they knew to try and scrape together the $145,000 that was being demanded, which they were able to do. They got family and friends and people to give everything that they could, and they got the money together. They wired it to that bank account in Dubai. Once the money made it to the kidnappers' bank, all communication between the kidnappers and the family, along with the FBI, completely stopped. After they got the money, the family asked for proof of life a number of times more, but they never heard another word from anyone, not the kidnappers and not from Alexander himself. So at that point, the FBI was no longer going to be working on Alexander's case undercover. They were going to have to make their presence known to the kidnappers, that they were working this case and that they fully intended to figure out who did this and what happened to Alexander. This FBI operation went from monitoring phone calls to a full-on, boots-on-the-ground, multi-agency investigation. They were looking wherever the leads would take them, wherever the leads wouldn't take them. They were speaking to anyone willing to speak to them about anything that they might know about a Russian kidnapping scheme, ring, conglomerate, organization, whatever. When reviewing the evidence that they did have in Alexander's case, which was the cell phone records, Alexander's business ties and connections that really didn't reveal that Alexander had any known enemies, the fact that the kidnappers were Russian, that they spoke Russian, but they didn't appear to have any ties to the Russian media, and that unidentified man and the car at the ATM taking money out of Alexander's account. Of that information that they had at that point in time, they realized that the best clue that was left behind by the kidnappers was that foreign bank account in Dubai. The FBI had an office in Dubai, so the investigators on the case were going to go there themselves and check it out. In the meantime, the kidnappers moved on to their next victim. We will circle back to Alexander's investigation in just a little bit, because that was still ongoing as the kidnappers, they moved on to their next victim after Alex. The next month, in January of 2002, Mikhel and Kadamovas got word that Jurijus Kadamovas was back from Russia. Remember him? They tried to use Rita Peckler to lure him in to pay a ransom. Yeah, and it didn't happen, and he ran away. Well, he's back in Southern California. This time, Kadamovas and Mikhel, they were going to try to get to him through his business partner, somebody who had a closer relationship with him. They had been longtime business partners and friends, and that would be a gentleman named Nick Karabadze. The two men are film producers, and they were actually pretty well known in the Russian community in Southern California for their work. And it was also pretty common knowledge that George was exceedingly wealthy. And another thing that turned out to be what I believe just a huge coincidence, Alexander's brother is actually acquainted, or was actually acquainted, with Nick, the next victim that came after his brother. They had mutual friends in common, and they had even run into each other at some social gatherings. So I'm getting that the Russian community in and around Los Angeles and Southern California is a pretty tight-knit community. The next kidnapping attempt, it would be their fourth. Mikhel and Kadamovas decided that they were going to bring Kadamovas' girlfriend in on the ruse. Her name was, or is, Natalia Solovyeva. They were going to have her call Nick and tell him that she was given his phone number by a friend and she wanted to meet him. I believe it was sort of in a flirtatious capacity. The accomplice I mentioned earlier, Alec, he would later admit to being a part of this plan as well to kidnap Nick. But he made it clear that the two who were calling the shots every single step of the way was Kadamovas and Mikhel. Natalia called Nick and asked him to come meet her, where she told him was a private club. But it was actually Mikhel and Kadamovas' Design Waterworld business. You see, the inside of the fish aquarium business, it looked more like a social hangout spot, like where Russian people would sit around and maybe play cards and drink vodka and plan crimes. That's what this place looked like. So when Nick would get there, it would kind of look like a little bar. It had a pool table in the middle of the room also. So yeah, it's not 100% clear from the outside that this isn't an aquarium business, but once you get inside, yeah, no, they're not selling fish. They're sending people to sleep with the fish. When Nick arrived at Design Waterworld, Altmanis and Alec were shooting some pool. Mikhel and Krylov were drinking vodka, probably. And Kadamovas was standing behind the bar, maybe being the bartender? Not really. He was hidden behind the bar because he had a gun in his hand, a revolver. And Mikhel and Altmanis also were armed with guns. They had those tucked into their jackets. Natalia greeted Nick and asked him to get her a drink while Krylov shut and locked the door through which he came. It was then Nick was attacked. Mikhel handcuffed him to a chair and took away his keys, wallet, and cell phone. Then they began to explain their plan to him, that they wanted his help to trap his business partner, Jurijus Kadamovas. Nick was willing to comply with their demands, so at the direction of Mikhel and Kadamovas, Nick called George, and somehow he managed to talk this guy, who was highly suspicious the first time around, to come down to Design Waterworld. I mean, you would think a guy who ran wee all the way home to Russia at the first sign of a threat would be a little bit more difficult to convince to come meet some strangers at some strange place that he's never been to before. But then again, I guess George is not expecting this to be happening by way of his own business partner and good friend. Like I said earlier, dreamers, I know there are a lot of names and you really don't have to remember them all. I am trying to remind you of the roles in this case as we go along here. So getting back to George at the Design Water World, there were a total of 5 kidnappers there waiting for him: Mikhel, Kadamovas, and their 3 prime accomplices, Altmanis, Krylov, and Alec. I can't say his last name very well, so I've been calling him by the abbreviation of his first name. So those are the 3 accomplices. They all converged on George as soon as he got there. Mikhel handcuffed him and took his keys, wallet, and phone. Then Kadamovas and Mikhel placed Nick and George in the back of their van and drove them over to Kadamovas' house this time, where they ordered George to contact another business partner of his named Konstantinos Tesik and to plead with him to transfer $940,000 into a foreign bank account. This whole ordeal with Nick and George being held at Kadamovas' lasted 4 days. And during those 4 days, Kadamovas recorded George's voice in order to use that recording to extort more money after he was dead. It was during these 4 days and during this kidnapping that Kadamovas made a random comment to one of his accomplices, Alec, that he fully intended to continue abducting people and throwing their bodies into the New Malone's reservoir until he's able to compile $50 million, even if it meant that the bodies were going to start piling up above the surface of the water. And well, this time, again, for the second time, they got the money. George's business partner, Konstantinos, did not know it at the time that he sent the money that George and Nick were being held hostage for ransom. But eventually, Konstantinos would learn the truth about the kidnapping. Mikhel confirmed that they did receive the $940,000, and that is when Nick and George's lives met with their expiration dates. They were now no longer any use to the kidnappers, so it was time to get rid of them. The 5 kidnappers got Nick and George drunk on vodka and drove them in 2 separate vehicles to the reservoir. This time, along the 6-hour drive, they were actually pulled over by the highway patrol for following too closely to each other. Mikhel got out of his car to speak directly to the officer, and he was able to smooth things over, and that officer eventually let them go along their way with a warning. Later on, sometime down the line, Natalia would report that the plan was for Kadamovas to kill that police officer if anything went wrong, or if this police officer that had pulled them over just happened to see something untoward was going on, or perhaps he may have noticed that 2 of the 7 men in these cars were being held against their will. But that officer was spared, and these knuckleheads continued along their way to the body dump. So when they arrived at the New Malones Reservoir, Mikhel placed a bag over Nick's head. He tightened the plastic tie around his neck as tightly as he could, and he suffocated Nick to death. One of the accomplices, Altmanis, tied a weight around Nick's body, a weight plate or a plate weight, whichever way it is. I don't know. My mind is becoming mushy right now. So then he and Mikhel picked up Nick's body with the weight plate attached to it and threw him off the Steve Knott Bridge, which is another bridge at that same New Malone's reservoir. George had already been killed and thrown into the water first, ahead of Nick. Mikhel did comment that George was a lot harder to kill because he was so strong. Well, or maybe Mikhel just isn't as strong or as lethal as he would like to think that he is because he just sucks at murdering people. Anyway, sometime down the line, within hours or days, Mikhel used Nick's and George's ATM cards to take money out of their bank accounts, and he was captured on surveillance doing so. Kadamovas then gave the ATM cards to an associate of his named Vladimir. Oh my God. I can't say this one. We'll just call him Vlad. So Kadamovas gave Vlad the 2 ATM cards, and he took those cards over to Germany to withdraw more money. Mikhel also used one of George's ATM cards to purchase nearly $10,000 in electronic equipment. He also called George's business partner again, the one who sent them the $940,000, Konstantinos. Yeah, Mikhel called him, and he was in London. And after they got in touch over the phone, he sent him a fax. And it was another ransom note. And it was a note that George himself had signed before he was killed, demanding another $4 million. So Konstantinos began to try and negotiate with George's kidnappers to let him go. After all, he'd already sent nearly $1 million to them. Konstantinos ended up tape recording all of the phone calls that he had with these guys. In one of the conversations, Konstantinos said, "You have to understand the people are ready. We collect the funds. Everything is ready. But they all need to hear his voice to be sure that if he is okay. Oh, because that's big money. We paid already $1 million. We paid $1 million for nothing. Give me his voice today, and we do operation." So Konstantinos wants proof of life before he sends any more money, because he certainly didn't get George or Nick back when he sent that $940,000. But the kidnapper on the other end of the line said that they would not be doing any more negotiating. Konstantinos tried to insist that they let him hear George's voice, and they continued to refuse, and they were at this impasse. Neither one of them looked like they were going to budge. So Konstantinos decided to report this kidnapping to the FBI, and that's when the agents on Alexander's case were notified that they had more Russian kidnappings. And they were fairly certain that this was not a coincidence, that they were dealing with the same people. The MOs were very similar. The only difference this time is that they were demanding a hell of a lot more money, and technically they had 2 hostages this time around. Even though one of them was not meant to be a hostage, he ended up turning into one to prevent him from ever becoming a witness. These kidnappings, these Russian kidnappings, were also happening in very close proximity to each other. All of the various locations are very close in the San Fernando Valley. And the way that the prepaid phones were used and registered with fictitious information was also very similar. So the FBI were convinced that they are dealing with the single kidnapping ring, and that these cases that they have are related. I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story right here, but we'll come back to this in just a moment. So when all was said and done, Mikhel and Kadamovas were able to get more than $1 million in this kidnapping and holding people hostage for ransom scheme. And they used that money to fund a luxurious lifestyle. Nice cars, they made home improvements, they bought lavish gifts for their girlfriends, they took expensive vacations. They're just living life on the lives of the people that they kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. Okay, once again, I got a little ahead of myself. Going back to the FBI agents who were just working on Alexander's case. They had an FBI office at the American Embassy in Dubai, and they were the ones who were going to arrange for the FBI to travel there in order to investigate the banking end of this kidnapping. You know, the whole follow the money idea. The $235,000 had been sent to a bank account in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And the government there in Dubai was cooperative with the agents from California and was cool with them coming into their country to investigate this case. They were able to track down the account managers at the bank where the accounts were opened, and they were able to access the records for those accounts that the ransom money was wired to. And from there, the FBI found out that there had been 2 Russian people who had been making withdrawals from the ransom account in person there at the bank in Dubai. So they were quickly tracked down and taken into custody. They were turned over to the FBI and brought back to California and subjected to interrogation. As it turned out, these guys really weren't in the know about where this money had come from. They were just pawns, I guess, for lack of a better word. They were told that the money needed to be taken out of that bank account that they were withdrawing from and moved to a different bank account, but they weren't given any details about where that money had come in from. They had no idea that money was ransom paid for a kidnapping where the kidnapping victim was never given back. And it would be in Dubai that the FBI agents would discover a critical piece of evidence that would prove to be the big break in Alexander's case that they so desperately needed. When the 2 Russians were arrested in Dubai, there was some paperwork that had been seized from them. Well, it turned out that on one of those pieces of paper, amongst the seized documents, was a memo that stated some of the money in the bank was to be sent to a business in California called Design Water World Incorporated. That good old fish aquarium shop / front that Kadamovas and Mikhel owned together. In fact, $32,000 of that ransom money was sent to an account at Bank of America owned by Design Water World. And there the FBI finally made their connection back to Southern California, that connection that they had been desperately looking for. Okay, I'm fairly certain that I'm going to break this episode into 2 parts, but before I end this one, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what I mentioned earlier regarding the kidnappings for ransom being kind of an outdated crime here in the United States. I talked about that in the beginning. It still happens, and while I was looking around for information about kidnappings and statistics, I did find an article that was a top result entitled Kidnapping for Ransom by Frank Zuccarello. That felt really good to say, huh? Instead of Russian, you get a good, nice Italian name that just kind of rolls out of your mouth. Anyway, his article said that Phoenix, Arizona had become the kidnapping capital of the United States because of its proximity to Mexico. And while it is impossible to provide accurate numbers when it comes to kidnapping, it is estimated that there are anywhere between 12,500 and 25,000 kidnappings every year around the world, and those figures are on the rise. The article pointed out that there are very few kidnappings that make big national or international news, but when they do, it is only a very select few that garner the greatest amount of media attention. And because these kidnappers that do these things do them outside the United States, they really don't worry too much about media exposure. They don't fear attention because the attention is rarely, if ever, on them. And that goes for international travelers too. International travelers tend to look at statistics and they see very low numbers when it comes to kidnapping, and they don't worry about planning and taking those well-deserved vacations. Anybody who is traveling can be a potential target. Anybody who's even just living on Earth can be a potential target. However, it is also a well-known fact that not only do the media cherry-pick what stories make the lead in the nightly news, chances are the media will be giving most of their attention to crime, drama, and scandal if it involves high-profile individuals, celebrities, sports figures, and billionaires. There are lots of hotspots around the world, and while this article is a little bit older and things may have changed during COVID, I mean, a lot of things are different since 2020 and 2021. But as far as hotspots are concerned, I mentioned Phoenix. Outside the United States, Latin America has seen huge spikes in kidnappings for ransom over the years. Kidnappings in Mexico are also big business, so much so I wouldn't even be surprised if it had an impact on the overall economy of their country. It's hard to say because kidnapping is difficult to track, the money is hard to follow, and while we already know that Latin America as a whole, and I'm talking about, everything south of the United States, like Mexico, Central America, and South America, that's what I'm talking about. Those whole economies could potentially collapse if they didn't have some form of illegal trafficking going on. You don't realize how much of an impact a phenomenon can have on us as a whole. Things like human trafficking, drug trafficking, COVID impacted us in many ways that we're still learning about. Take a look at Taylor Swift, for example. She's touring the world like she is. I just read an article last month talking about how Taylor's Eras Tour is actually boosting the entire world economy, with estimates being as high as $5 billion being added to it. The article also went on to point to Southern California being a potential danger zone because of its close proximity to Mexico as well. War zones are also considered to be dangerous places to travel. I'm not the biggest traveler in the world, but I don't see myself choosing to vacation where there's war, but it's just me. Doesn't sound fun, and it doesn't sound like a vacation. The fact is, a kidnapping can happen anywhere, but the statistics show that where there is civil, social, and political unrest, the potential for falling victim to a kidnapping increases. This article also pointed out that Americans should be aware to leave that false sense of security at home when you travel. Don't think that if you run into any trouble abroad, that you can just contact the local law enforcement and they'll be like, okay, we'll be right there to help you. No. Americans tend to have a certain amount of trust in police. Not all of us. Don't freaking beat me up over this, but some of us have trust in the police. Some of us don't. It depends on your personal experience. It's a touchy topic and we're not going to get into it right now. But Americans are warned to not travel to any foreign country with that sentiment being your go-to plan. If things go wrong, I'll just call the police. Foreign police may not be as trustworthy as they should be. In some countries, police are even complicit with kidnappings. And that is a scary thing to end this on. I'm going to pause it, like I said, and divide this episode into 2 parts because this one just topped an hour and I'm not even really halfway through the script, actually, which means this might extend past 2 hours, so that can be 2 separate episodes. And I don't plan I don't plan, period. And that includes these episodes. Lately, I haven't been on top of it. Let's just say that. I'm trying my best to get on track. I'm going to record part 2 for you right after this. And then hopefully I'll be able to sit down again later today and record the Patreon bonus. Today being Monday, August 14th. Maybe I'll take a nap and then I'll record again. If you want to binge these 2 parts together at the same time, I will have the second part out by the end of today or tomorrow morning at the latest. Then you'll have the whole story to listen to back to back. I'm going to get this published and then I'm going to get on social media to say hi to everybody. And I'm going to tell you about this new episode that I'm about to drop, and I'm going to come back and record the second part. So I hope everyone has a really wonderful week. I hope you all are doing well. I'm not doing all that great, and I haven't been for the past month. Maybe at the end of part 2, when this episode is over, I'll open up to you a little bit about what's been going on with me. It's not a big deal, but it kind of sort of paralyzed me emotionally for about 4 weeks, and I'm still kind of numb right now. But I'll talk about it at the end of part 2. How about that? If you want to listen and hear about all the petty nonsense that's going on with me, I'll put it at the end of the episode. So if you don't give a shit and don't want to hear me complaining about my life, then you can just click past on to whatever's next in your queue. All right. That's all I got. I promise you I'm okay. I'm still going through it, but I'm okay. I'm here, and that's just going to have to be good enough for today. I'll be back soon with part 2, and until next time, sweet dreams.